How can a single man transform the history of the Church and leave such a profound mark on Christian spirituality? Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, born into the Burgundian nobility in 1090, is perhaps the most brilliant example of how divine grace can work wonders through a soul completely surrendered to Christ. A Cistercian monk, founder of monasteries, tireless preacher, advisor to popes and kings, defender of the faith, mystic, and doctor of the Church. Bernhard stood as a beacon of light in a time of turbulence. His writings, his works, and his example continue to inspire the faithful nearly 1,000 years after his birth, showing us that holiness is not a privilege for the few, but a universal call to which we can all respond with generosity. Chapter 1. The birth of a light in dark times. The castle of Fontaine-les-Dijon was filled with joy that day in 1090, when the noble Theodore Sorel and his virtuous wife Alice of Montbard received the blessing of a third son. The family, distinguished by its piety and nobility, could not imagine that this child, whom they baptized Bernhard, was destined to become one of the most luminous figures of the Catholic Church. Young Bernhard grew up in a home where faith was not merely a family tradition, but a deeply lived reality. His mother, Alice, a woman of extraordinary piety, instilled in her 7 children an ardent love for Christ and the Virgin Mary. While other nobles primarily educated their children in the arts of war and politics, Theodore and Alice ensured that Bernhard and his siblings also received a solid education in the Holy Scriptures and the doctrine of the Church. 11th century Europe was a scene of profound contradictions. While the Catholic faith permeated all aspects of life, serious moral crises also manifested themselves in both civil society and within the Church itself. Lay investiture, Nicolaism, and simony were evils that deeply affected the clergy, while power struggles between nobles and kings sowed violence and disorder in Christian territories. In this context of light and shadow, God was preparing in young Bernhard an instrument of renewal and holiness. Even as a child, Bernhard showed signs of exceptional intelligence and an uncommon spiritual sensitivity. Chroniclers recount that on Christmas Eve, when Bernhard was only 6 years old, he had a prophetic dream in which he beheld the newborn infant Jesus with astonishing clarity. This event, which he himself would recount years later, profoundly marked his soul and awakened in him a special devotion to the mystery of the incarnation of the divine Word. The premature death of his mother, when Bernhard was about 15, was a devastating blow to the young man. However, in the designs of Providence, this painful event would serve to help Bernhard understand more deeply the fleeting nature of earthly life and turn his gaze towards eternal goods. The seed of vocation that God had planted in his heart would soon begin to germinate, although he would still have to overcome the trials and temptations common to youth. Chapter 2. Youth and the Divine Call. The years of adolescence and early adulthood were not easy for Bernhard. Endowed with a graceful physique, brilliant intelligence, and the prestige of his noble birth, the world offered him paths to human glory and earthly pleasures. The schools of Châtillon-sur-Seine, where he was sent to complete his education, opened the doors to the knowledge of Latin classics and the liberal arts, disciplines in which he quickly excelled due to his sharp memory and capacity for understanding. One incident profoundly marked his path to holiness. One day, while Bernhard was alone in his room, a young woman of remarkable beauty appeared before him with clearly immodest intentions. The young man, surprised but firm in his determination to preserve his chastity, shouted, "Thieves!" with all his might. The girl fled in shame, and Bernhard understood that God's grace had helped him in that crucial moment. This victory over temptation strengthened his resolve to dedicate himself entirely to the Lord. The divine call manifested itself with increasing clarity during a winter's day. While riding alone towards his parents' castle, Bernhard was caught in a blizzard. Seeking shelter, he entered a small chapel by the roadside. There, prostrate before an image of the Virgin Mary, he experienced a profound inner conversion. The words of the gospel resonated in his soul. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Bernhard understood that God was calling him to abandon the promises of the world to follow Christ in religious life. With the fire of divine love burning in his heart, Bernhard not only decided to consecrate himself to God, but his apostolic zeal impelled him to share this grace with his loved ones. With persuasive eloquence and the example of his determination, he managed to convince his 4 brothers, his uncle and several friends to join him on the path of total surrender to Christ. This group of 30 young nobles, led by Bernhard, surprised everyone when they announced their intention to enter together the monastery of Citeaux, known for the austerity of its observance. Before taking this decisive step, Bernhard wanted to say goodbye to his family home. The scene moved everyone present. The young nobleman, barely 22 years old, renounced the riches, honors, and pleasures that his position guaranteed him to embrace poverty, obedience, and chastity in monastic life. His younger brother, Nivard, was playing in the castle courtyard when Bernhard approached to say goodbye. "We leave you all our possessions," he said. The child, with surprising maturity, replied, "You the heavens and I the earth? That's not a fair division." Years later, Nivard would also follow in his brother's footsteps in the Cistercian cloister. Chapter 3. The Monk of Citeaux. The Abbey of Citeaux had been founded in 1098 by Saint Robert of Molesme with the purpose of restoring the strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict. Under the guidance of St. Stephen Harding, the third abbot, the monastery lived in extreme poverty and penitential rigor. However, these very demands had discouraged many potential candidates, and the community feared for its survival. The arrival of Bernhard and his companions in 1112 was received as a providential gift that ensured the continuity of the Cistercian project. From the very first moment, Bernhard surrendered himself with extraordinary fervor to the monastic life. This young man, who had received a refined education and known the comforts befitting his noble status, embraced with joy the privations of the cloister, the hard manual labor, the rigorous fasting, the prolonged vigils, and the continuous silence. His fellow monks watched in astonishment as Bernhard seemed to completely forget the needs of his body. To live absorbed in the contemplation of celestial realities, this immeasurable dedication soon affected his health. His stomach, weakened by fasting, could barely retain food, and his body, exhausted by penance, succumbed to a serious illness. Abbot Stephen, concerned for the life of this exceptional monk, temporarily excused him from some community duties and ordered him to moderate his austerities. Bernhard obeyed, although with the inner conviction that a monk who does not progress in virtue each day retreats. This illness, which would accompany him throughout his life, would be for him a constant reminder of human fragility and an occasion to exercise patience. Bernhard's spiritual formation at Citeaux was founded on 2 essential pillars: the Holy Scriptures and the rule of Saint Benedict. Day and night he meditated on the sacred texts, acquiring such a profound knowledge of the Bible that his later writings are saturated with biblical references. At the same time, the wisdom contained in the Benedictine rule shaped his life according to the monastic ideal of placing nothing before the love of Christ. The perfect synthesis between contemplation and action, prayer and work, solitude and community life, characteristic of Benedictine monasticism, found in Bernhard an exemplary exponent. Bernhard's novitiate, although marked by physical trials, was a period of intense spiritual growth. His novice master was impressed by the humility and docility of this young nobleman who accepted any correction with gratitude, considering it as medicine for his soul. After a year of probation, Bernhard pronounced his solemn vows, definitively consecrating himself to God according to the rule of Saint Benedict and the Cistercian constitutions. The ceremony of religious profession, simple yet profoundly significant, sealed the pact of love between God and his servant. Bernhard was then 23 years old, and no one could imagine the mission that Providence had in store for him. Chapter 4. The founder of Clairvaux. The prosperity of Citeaux, spurred by the arrival of Bernhard and his companions, soon demanded the founding of new houses where Cistercian life could flourish. In 1115, just 3 years after entering the monastery, Bernhard was appointed by Abbot Stephen to lead a group of 12 monks who would establish a new foundation. The young monk, barely 25 years old and still suffering the effects of his delicate health, received the news with fear and trembling, aware of the enormous responsibility that fell upon his shoulders. The small group of monks, carrying only what was strictly necessary, set out for the territory of Champagne, where Lord Hugh of Champagne had granted them land in a wooded valley known as Wormwood, due to the abundance of this bitter plant. Upon arriving at the place, Bernhard had a supernatural intuition. This gloomy valley would be transformed into a place of light and grace. That's why he decided to call it Clara Vallis, Clairvaux, a name that expressed his hope that the clarity of monastic life would shine there in all its splendor. The beginnings were extremely harsh. The monks built with their own hands a modest oratory and some wooden huts for lodging. The first winter was especially severe. The scarcity of food was such that they had to survive on barley bread, millet and wild lentils. Illness constantly lurked, and some of the brothers began to doubt the viability of the project. Bernhard, despite his own physical weakness, sustained everyone with his unwavering faith and his hope in divine providence, often repeating, "If you truly seek God, you will find everything you need." Gradually, living conditions at Clairvaux improved. Bernard's reputation for holiness attracted numerous candidates, including men of letters, nobles, and even former knights who wished to embrace the Cistercian life under his guidance. The monastery had to be expanded to accommodate this growing community. The Duke of Champagne, impressed by the virtue of these monks, increased his donations, allowing them to build more suitable buildings and develop the agricultural and craft activities that would ensure their livelihood. As abbot, Bernhard combined firmness in observance with a delicate understanding of human weaknesses. Demanding of himself to the extreme, he knew how to adapt to the possibilities of each of his monks, guiding them patiently on the path of evangelical perfection. His spiritual conferences, overflowing with biblical wisdom and a deep understanding of the human heart, were eagerly awaited by the monks. Many of these teachings, collected by his disciples, would later form the basis of his written works, such as the famous sermons on the Song of Songs, where Bernhard develops his mystical theology of divine love. Chapter 5. The Preacher of Fire. Bernhard's word possessed an extraordinary power that moved hearts. This grace initially manifested itself within the monastery walls, where his homilies and conferences transformed the monks. But it soon transcended the limits of Clairvaux. Bishops, abbots and nobles began to request his presence to preach on various occasions, recognizing in him a true messenger of God, capable of conveying the gospel message with uncommon clarity and fervor. What distinguished Bernhard's preaching was not so much rhetorical elegance, although he perfectly mastered the art of oratory, but the authenticity that emanated from his words. When he spoke of the love of Christ, his eyes lit up and his voice acquired a tone that penetrated the deepest part of his listeners' souls. The preacher must be a mother, not a teacher, he used to say, expressing his conviction that true preaching is born of love and seeks to engender Christ in the hearts of those who listen. An event revealed the prophetic dimension of his ministry. In the city of Dijon, during a solemn celebration, Bernhard preached against the vices that corrupted the society of his time. His denunciation of usury, lust, and the oppression of the poor by the powerful caused a commotion in the assembly. The following day, numerous nobles flocked to Clairvaux to confess their sins and restore ill-gotten gains. Among them was a well-known usurer from the region, whose conversion caused general astonishment. "It wasn't my words," Bernhard would later explain. but the divine grace of God that touched his heart through them. His sermon's fame preceded him wherever he went. In 1140, during his journey to Rome to attend the Council of Latran, crowds thronged to hear him, even though many didn't understand the Latin in which he preached. When asked how he explained this phenomenon, Bernhard replied simply, "Hearts have a language that transcends words." Indeed, numerous accounts confirm that people unfamiliar with Latin felt a profound spiritual stirring upon hearing him, as if his words penetrated directly into their souls, beyond the linguistic barrier. However, perhaps Bernhard's most impactful sermon was that of the Second Crusade. In 1146, at the request of Pope Eugene III, a former monk of Clairvaux, Bernhard traveled throughout France and Germany, preaching the need to defend the Holy Lands, then threatened by the Turks. At the Assembly of Vézelay, his passionate appeal provoked such enthusiasm that those present, including King Louis VII of France, took up the cross as a sign of their commitment. Witnesses recount that it was necessary to tear apart Bernhard's own cloak to make crosses, as those initially prepared proved insufficient for the flood of volunteers. "God is the one who calls. I am merely an unworthy instrument," the saint would later comment, aware that this massive response was the work of divine grace acting through his preaching. Chapter 6. Counselor to Popes and Kings. Bernhard's wisdom and holiness quickly made him an indispensable advisor to the highest echelons of the Church and Christian kingdoms. In 1130, when a schism divided Christendom following the simultaneous election of two popes, Innocent II and Anacletus II, Bernhard was summoned to the Council of Étampes to help discern who was the rightful successor of Peter. His intervention was decisive. After carefully examining the circumstances of both elections, he declared in favor of Innocent II, significantly contributing to his recognition by most Christian princes. For the 8 years the schism lasted, Bernhard devoted his energy and prestige to the unity of the Church. He tirelessly traveled throughout Europe, visiting courts and monasteries to persuade kings, nobles, and prelates of Innocent II's legitimacy. His interview with William X of Aquitaine, a supporter of Anacletus, is particularly memorable. After exhausting all arguments without managing to convince him, Bernhard interrupted the Mass he was celebrating before the Duke and, taking the consecrated host in his hands, addressed him with these words, "Behold the judge before whom we must all appear. Will you dare to reject the vicar of him whose body I hold in my hands?" Impressed by this gesture, William prostrated himself and promised to obey Innocent II. No less significant was his relationship with Pope Eugene III, who had been a monk at Clairvaux under Bernard's guidance. When Bernhard of Pisa, as he was called before his pontifical election, was raised to the See of Peter in 1145, Bernhard wrote him his famous treatise De Consideration, a profound reflection on the responsibilities of the papal office. In this work, with the confidence given to him by their former master-disciple relationship, Bernhard did not hesitate to remind the new pontiff that power had been granted to him to serve, not to dominate, and that he should be father of the poor and defender of justice. Kings and princes also sought his counsel on both spiritual and temporal matters. Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, Roger VI of Sicily, and other sovereigns maintained regular correspondence with him. However, Bernhard never allowed himself to be dazzled by this proximity to power. In his letters to the powerful, he did not hesitate to admonish them when their actions deviated from Christian justice. To King Louis VII, who had committed grave abuses against the Church, he wrote, "A king's glory lies in loving justice. There is no greater service he can render to the crown than to submit to the gentle yoke of Christ." One of Bernhard's most delicate interventions in state affairs was the reconciliation between the rival families of the Hohenstaufen and the Welf, whose confrontation threatened to plunge the empire into civil war. At the Diet of Frankfurt in 1142, Bernhard, with the moral authority everyone recognized in him, managed to get both sides to accept a peace agreement. "Peace is the fruit of justice and love," he declared on that occasion, "and there is no more glorious victory than that obtained over one's own pride for the common good." Chapter 7. The Defender of the Faith. The Church of the 12th century faced numerous doctrinal challenges. Various heretical movements, such as the Cathars, the Petrobrusians, and the Henricians, denied fundamental aspects of the Catholic faith and attracted numerous followers. In this context, Bernhard emerged as a strong defender of orthodoxy, combining doctrinal clarity with an apostolic zeal that sought not only to refute error, but also to rescue those who had been deceived by it. The most well-known confrontation was undoubtedly the one he had with Peter Abelard, a brilliant philosopher and theologian whose teachings on the Trinity and other mysteries of the faith Bernhard considered dangerously rationalistic. After several attempts at private dialogue, Bernhard requested a public debate that took place at the Council of Sens in 1140. There, he precisely set forth 16 propositions taken from Abelard's works that he considered contrary to Catholic doctrine. Although the debate did not reach completion because Abelard appealed directly to Rome, the council condemned the questioned theses, a sentence that was later confirmed by Pope Innocent II. This episode has often been interpreted as a clash between faith and reason. But such a view simplifies the complexity of the matter. Bernhard did not oppose the use of reason in theology, as demonstrated by the logical soundness of his own writings, but rather what he perceived as an excessive rationalism that sought to reduce the mysteries of faith to purely human concepts. "Faith seeks understanding finds," he wrote, "but the divine mystery always exceeds our comprehension." Years later, Abelard and Bernhard reconciled, and the former spent his last days in the Cluniac monastery of Saint Marcel, where he died in peace with the Church. His confrontation with the popular heresies spreading through southern France was even more dramatic. In 1145, Bernhard embarked on an apostolic mission to Languedoc, where Henry of Lausanne, a former Benedictine monk, had disseminated doctrines contrary to the sacraments and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Bernhard's arrival in Albi, one of the centers of the heresy, was met with hostility. Only 30 people came to hear him on the first day. However, the situation changed dramatically when, after celebrating Mass, Bernhard blessed loaves of bread and distributed them among the sick. The numerous cases of healing that occurred were interpreted as a divine sign confirming the authenticity of his mission. For several weeks, Bernhard traveled through towns and villages, preaching with simplicity and firmness the truths of the faith. His approach to the heretics combined doctrinal clarity with a pastoral charity that sought their conversion. "Error is combated with truth, but those who err are overcome with love," he used to repeat. This attitude, coupled with his life of evident holiness, achieved what force had not. Numerous followers of Henry abandoned the heresy and returned to communion with the Catholic Church. In his later years, Bernhard showed a growing concern about the doctrines of Gilbert of Poitiers, Bishop of Poitiers, whose Trinitarian speculations he considered dangerous. At the Council of Reims in 1148, Bernhard presented a clear and precise Trinitarian profession of faith, developed in collaboration with other theologians, which was approved by the bishops present. Pope Eugene III, while not explicitly condemning Gilbert, ordered him to correct his teaching in accordance with the traditional faith of the Church, a resolution that the bishop humbly accepted. Chapter 8. The Devotee of the Blessed Virgin. Bernhard's devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary occupies a central place in his spirituality and his legacy to the Church. From his childhood, educated by a deeply Marian mother, Bernhard cultivated a filial love for the Mother of God that would later manifest itself in his writings, sermons, and pastoral work. It is no exaggeration to say that he was one of the great promoters of Marian devotion in the Middle Ages, deserving the title by which he would be known centuries later, the Singer of Mary. In his numerous sermons on Marian feasts, Bernhard developed a theology that highlighted Mary's role in the plan of salvation and in the spiritual life of every Christian. For him, Mary is the Stella Maris, the star of the sea that guides the faithful through the storms of life to the safe harbor that is Christ. "Look to the star, invoke Mary," he wrote in one of his most celebrated homilies. "If she sustains you, you will not fall. If she protects you, you will fear nothing. If she guides you, you will not grow weary. If she is favorable to you, you will reach the harbor." Mary's presence in Bernhard's daily life manifested itself in multiple ways. Witnesses to his life recount how he frequently interrupted his activities at the sound of the Angelus to gather in prayer before the Mother of God. The salutation Ave Maria, which was then beginning to spread as a popular prayer, was constantly on his lips. Tradition holds that on one occasion, as Bernhard passed before an image of the Virgin with the infant Jesus in her arms, he greeted her with the words, "Salve, Regina," Hail, Queen, to which the image replied, "Salve, Bernhard," Hail, Bernhard. This episode, recorded in later iconography, symbolizes the intimate spiritual relationship between the saint and the Mother of God. One of Bernhard's most significant contributions to Mariology was his teaching on Mary as mediatrix of all graces. In his sermon De Aqueductu, on the aqueduct, he uses this image to explain how all divine graces reach the faithful through Mary. God has willed that we should have nothing that does not pass through the hands of Mary. This doctrine, which would be developed by later theologians, underscores the Virgin's unique role in the distribution of divine gifts, always subordinate to and in perfect harmony with the unique mediation of Christ. The final great test of his Marian devotion was the expansion of the cult of the Virgin through the Cistercian order. Under his influence, all Cistercian monasteries were dedicated to Saint Mary, and the white habit of the monks was interpreted as a symbol of the Virgin's purity. The main Marian feasts were celebrated with special solemnity in the monasteries of the order, and the hymns in honor of Mary occupied a prominent place in the Cistercian liturgy. In this way, Bernhard decisively contributed to the spread of devotion to the Mother of God throughout Europe, leaving an indelible mark on Christian popular piety. Chapter 9. The Mystic of God. The contemplative dimension constitutes the core of Bernhard's spiritual personality. Despite his intense outward activity as a reformer, preacher, and counselor, he always retained a profound spirit of recollection that allowed him to remain intimately united with God. His mystical writings, especially his commentaries on the Song of Songs, reveal a direct and personal experience of divine love that has been a source of inspiration for generations of seekers of God. For Bernhard, the path of spiritual life is fundamentally a journey of love. Inspired by the patristic tradition, especially St. Augustine, he develops a mysticism centered on the transformation of the soul by divine love. Love is sufficient in itself, it satisfies in itself, and in itself it is meritorious, he writes. It seeks no motive outside itself nor profit. Its fruit is its exercise. I love because I love to love. This conception of pure, selfless love, which finds its fullness in total surrender to God, constitutes the axis of his spiritual teaching. In his sermons on the Song of Songs, Bernhard interprets the amorous dialogue between the bridegroom and the bride as an expression of the relationship between Christ and the soul, or between Christ and the Church. With a language of great poetic beauty and theological depth, he describes the various degrees of this mystical love, from initial love, still mixed with fear and the search for comfort, to the perfect love that fully identifies with the will of the beloved. The soul that truly loves, he affirms, forgets even its own interest to please only the one it loves. Bernard's mystical experience is marked by a profound Christocentrism. For him, Christ is the absolute center of spiritual life, and all aspects of the Christian existence must be oriented towards him. His devotion to the humanity of Jesus, especially the mysteries of his birth and passion, reflects a spiritual sensitivity that knows how to discover in these historical events an inexhaustible source of contemplation. What can heal the wounds of my soul and purify my mind of vain thoughts better than meditating on the wounds of Christ? He wrote in one of his sermons on the Passion, "Witnesses to his life recount numerous episodes revealing the intensity of his mystical life. During the celebration of Mass, he often entered states of profound recollection, as if his spirit were wrapped into celestial realities." One monk recounted how, on a certain occasion, he saw a ray of light descend upon the altar while Bernhard consecrated the Eucharist, a visible manifestation of the divine presence that accompanied the saint. These extraordinary phenomena, however, were never sought by Bernhard, who warned his monks against the danger of confusing sensible consolations with authentic union with God. Humility constitutes for Bernhard the indispensable foundation of the mystical life. Only through the sincere knowledge of one's own nothingness and absolute dependence on divine grace can the soul fully open itself to God's action. In his treatise, De Gradibus Humilitatis et Superbiae, on the degrees of humility and pride, he describes with psychological and spiritual precision the 12 steps that lead from the most obstinate pride to the perfect humility that makes possible the vision of God. Humility, he affirms, is the virtue by which man, truly knowing himself, holds himself as vile. This virtue is proper to those who, raising their hearts by the degrees we describe, arrive from virtue to virtue until the vision of God. Chapter 10. Miracles and Wonders. Bernhard's holiness manifested itself visibly through numerous extraordinary events that accompanied his ministry. These signs, received with astonishment by his contemporaries, constituted a testimony of the divine power that acted through his servant. Far from being proud of them, Bernhard attributed them entirely to God's mercy, considering himself an unworthy instrument of such wonders. Miraculous healings occupy a prominent place among these prodigies. During his journey through Germany to preach the Second Crusade, a blind child was brought before him in the city of Speyer. Bernhard, moved by the faith of the parents, laid his hands on the child's eyes while invoking the intercession of the Virgin Mary. Before the astonished gaze of the multitude, including Emperor Conrad III, who witnessed the scene, the child instantly recovered his sight and could recognize his parents' faces for the first time. This miracle, documented by witnesses of undoubted credibility, was only one among the many that occurred on that apostolic mission. Equally astonishing was his ability to know the secrets of hearts. On a certain occasion, a young nobleman presented himself at Clairvaux, expressing his desire to embrace monastic life. While conversing with him, Bernhard discerned that his vocation was not authentic, but motivated by worldly interests. With delicacy but firmness, he revealed his true intentions, which the young man had not confessed to anyone. Impressed by this revelation, the nobleman recognized his lack of sincerity, and after a period of reflection, returned to Clairvaux with more authentic dispositions, eventually becoming an exemplary monk. His power over the natural elements manifested itself particularly during a severe drought that ravaged the Champagne region. The peasants, desperate at the loss of their crops, went to Bernhard imploring his intercession. The saint, after praying fervently throughout the night, celebrated Mass the following morning for this intention. While he was still at the altar, dark clouds began to form in the sky, and before the celebration concluded, a copious but gentle rain fell upon the thirsty fields. This event, considered miraculous by all the witnesses, increased the popular veneration of Bernhard, whom many began to invoke as a protector against natural calamities. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary events was his victory over an evil spirit that tormented a woman in the city of Nantes. All previous exorcisms had been unsuccessful, and the unfortunate woman suffered terrible torments. When Bernhard arrived in the city to preach, they begged him to intervene. After praying intensely, the saint approached the woman and, showing the blessed sacrament he carried with him, ordered the demon to leave that body. After a violent crisis, the woman was completely freed and could return to normal life. Bernhard used this episode to instruct the faithful on the need to frequent the sacraments and persevere in prayer as a defense against the snares of the evil one. However, beyond these extraordinary events, Bernhard's greatest miracle was undoubtedly the spiritual transformation he produced in those who came into contact with him. Men and women of all social conditions, from illiterate peasants to scholars and nobles, experienced a profound inner conversion after hearing his words or simply contemplating his example. This power to renew souls, more lasting than any physical healing, constitutes the authentic seal of his holiness and the reason why his influence persists through the centuries. Chapter 11. The Glorious Passing. The last years of Bernhard's life were marked by a progressive deterioration of his health. His body, weakened by austerities, incessant travels and the worries of his office, could barely respond to the demands of his always active spirit. Despite the care lavished upon him by his brothers of the community, the physical pains intensified day by day, offering him the opportunity to unite more intimately with the passion of Christ that he had so contemplated. In the spring of 1153, a serious stomach ailment, which prevented him from retaining almost any food, caused fear for his life. The monks, dismayed at the prospect of losing their spiritual father, redoubled their prayers and penances, begging God to preserve them for some time longer with their beloved abbot. Their pleas seemed to be heard when Bernhard experienced a slight improvement that allowed him to partially resume his activities. However, he himself understood that this was only a temporary respite, and he used these weeks to prepare his community for his imminent departure. During this time, Bernhard dedicated his dwindling strength to two tasks he considered paramount: completing his commentary on the Song of Solomon, a pinnacle of his mystical theology, and securing peace within the Church, threatened by fresh conflicts. When the bishops of Metz and Verdun came to Clairvaux, seeking his mediation in a dispute that threatened war, Bernhard, despite his extreme weakness, did not hesitate. He accompanied them to reconcile the warring factions. This peace mission, which proved successful, was his final public service to the church he so dearly loved. Returning to Clairvaux, Bernhard was acutely aware that his earthly days were numbered. He gathered the monks to deliver his final exhortations, urging them to remain faithful to the Cistercian observance and, above all, to the brotherly love that should characterize their communal life. "I leave you three treasures to preserve faithfully," he said, his voice already weakened: charity, humility, and obedience. "If you keep these, you will have nothing to fear on Judgment Day." These words, spoken with the authority of one who had fully lived what he taught, were etched in the hearts of his disciples as his most precious legacy. In the following days, as his condition worsened, Bernhard maintained an admirable serenity that edified all present. When physicians attempted new remedies to alleviate his suffering, he humbly thanked them for their efforts, but added with a smile, "Don't worry too much about this body, which will soon be dust. Worry more about your souls, which are eternal." To the monks who took turns at his bedside to attend to him, he requested that they recite psalms and prayers, especially those dedicated to the Virgin Mary, for whom he had always professed a tender devotion. On August 20th, 1153, the feast day of Saint Bernard of Menthon, the abbot of Clairvaux entered his agony. Surrounded by his brothers of the community who prayed amidst tears, Bernhard received the last sacraments with profound devotion. According to his biographer, William of Saint-Thierry, an eyewitness, In his final moments, the dying man's face was illuminated with an expression of ineffable joy, as if he already beheld celestial realities. With his last strength, he raised his hands to heaven while whispering, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Thus, at the age of 63, after 41 years of monastic life, Bernhard surrendered his soul to God. News of his death spread rapidly throughout Christendom, causing universal mourning. Monks, clergy, nobles, and common people flocked to Clairvaux to pay homage to the man many already considered a saint. His body was initially buried in the Abbey Church before the altar of the Virgin Mary, according to his wish. The numerous miracles that began to occur near his tomb confirmed popular veneration, and barely 20 years after his death in 1174, Pope Alexander III proceeded with his solemn canonization, declaring him a model of holiness for the entire Church. Chapter 12. A Prayer to Saint Bernard. O glorious Saint Bernard, sweet singer of Mary and mellifluous doctor of the Church, who with your burning word and luminous writings guided countless souls along the path of evangelical perfection. Look with kindness upon those who confidently come to your intercession. You, who were consumed by the fire of divine love, obtain for us the grace to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength. May our lives, like yours, be centered in Christ, the incarnate Word, contemplating him especially in the mysteries of his birth and his passion, where his infinite love shines most brightly. Father of monks and reformer of religious life, intercede for all those consecrated, that they may be faithful to their vocation and bear witness to the world, to the primacy of God and the beauty of a life surrendered to his service. Obtain also for Christian families the grace to raise their children in the holy fear of God, as your parents did, thus sowing seeds of future vocations. Intrepid defender of Catholic truth, help us to remain firm in the faith of our fathers, without being swept away by strange doctrines or seduced by the false promises of the world. May we be able to give a reason for our hope with gentleness and respect, always seeking truth in charity. Preacher of the divine word, teach us to nourish ourselves daily on Holy Scripture and to live according to its teachings. May your example inspire us to proclaim the gospel with courage and without compromise, first with the witness of a coherent life, and then with words that spring from a heart in love with Christ. Devout Son of Mary, instill in our hearts a tender and trusting love for the Mother of God and our Mother. Following your counsel, we will turn to her in all our needs, confident that whoever finds Mary finds life and attains the Lord's salvation. Contemplative of divine love, guide us on the path of prayer and contemplation, so that amidst our daily occupations we may keep our hearts lifted up to heavenly realities. Help us to discover that only in God does our restless soul find rest. O Saint Bernard, you who already enjoy the beatific vision with Christ, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints, do not forget those who still journey in this valley of tears. May we, through your intercession, obtain the grace of a holy life and a peaceful death, so that we may join you in the eternal praise of the Blessed Trinity. Amen.